Oh, hello and good morning. Happy Thursday, May 6th. We are already in the fifth month of this year, and you know what? That's just kind of wild to me. But as I've said so many times, time is relative, and you know what? At least vaccinations are getting rolled out, and people's things are starting to slowly kind of open up here in the States. And so it doesn't really feel like things are just blurring together completely anymore to a degree. I say that with a grain of salt, because things are still definitely feeling like they're just blurring together. But it feels like the days at least kind of have a sense of like a rhythm a bit the past couple weeks rather than I have no idea what day it is, and for all we know, it could be the year 2035 and I would still be in the same routine that I am in. But thankfully, that is slowly coming to an end, hopefully. Get vaccinated, y'all. I just joined the Pfizer crew this week, so really excited about that. All right, so today we are doing some lovely testing of the broadcast, so I do apologize in advance if there is any lagging audio issues, anything like that. As I mentioned for my Cozy Climate community in our Discord channels, that today's Cimpatico Daily is streaming here on Cimpatico, Twitter, and also YouTube. So if there is at any point any tech stuff that seems weird or sounds weird, please let me know in Cimpatico's chat, or go ahead and ping me in on Discord or Slack for my Cimpatico team, just so that way we can document this and see what's going on in regards to that. As per usual, Cimpatico Daily is more of a casual hangout, open-ended conversation, and at any point, if any of y'all who are watching would like to hop in and give your thoughts about certain news, events, topics, you're more than welcome to. Just let me know in the Cimpatico live chat over on cimpatico.tv, and we will arrange that. I think it was last week or 2 weeks ago now. I know this is where time is relative comes in, but we had a wonderful conversation with a bunch of nuclear professionals about the Fukushima water dumping, and it was really great just having them hop on in and have this conversation. And soon, if I can get over my procrastination, as I'm sure many of us have been feeling lately with like big projects or ideas, if I can get over my procrastination, there will soon be a video on the topic. But again, that is if I can get over the procrastination. So we'll see how that goes. Anyway, so today on Cimpatico, we will have 2 episodes at 11 a.m. Pacific, 12, 1, 2 p.m. Eastern. Our partner, Doug Parsons, host of the America Adapts podcast and host of the Climate Adaptation channel here on Cimpatico, will be interviewing Dave Jones, and the episode title is The Global Electricity Transition. A little bit about Dave Jones is that the caffeine is yet to fully set in. I'm just now sipping my brewed tea, so I do apologize for my slow tongue. My brain is going fast, my mouth is not. So, an electricity analyst for 20 years, Dave is now leading Ember's expansion beyond Europe and is lead author for Ember's Global Electricity Review. Previously, he worked as a front office electricity trading analyst at German utility E.ON, and he joined Ember's previous iteration, Sandbag, in 2014, working on coal phase-out in Europe. In this episode, Dave Jones discusses the world's transition from fossil to clean electricity, and will touch on how far the transition has come so far, what progress we are seeing towards 100% clean electricity by 2035 in OECD countries, and the phase-out of coal in Asia, and the gap in electricity sector still required to cap climate change at 1.5 degrees. So if any of you are interested in the grid, decarbonization, and developing electricity, and those who are curious about what's going on with the reliance on coal and the phase of that and the phase out of it in Asia, I do recommend this episode. Again, this will be at 11 a.m. Pacific, 2 p.m. Eastern, with our host, Doug Parsons, on the Climate Adaptation channel. You'll be able to watch that directly here on Cimpatico and YouTube. I do not believe this feed will be on our Twitter today, because I am doing the again, seeing how many things I can break today for documentation. So, but that will be available on Cimpatico and YouTube. I'm noticing my microphone is peaking a little bit here, so let me just, we're gonna try fiddling with a few things and see if this is any better. We'll just try settings directly on the microphone today. All right. And then, so after Doug's episode, we will have a few episode reruns so I can do some work and prepare for our episode on Climate EDU at 3 p.m. Pacific, 6 p.m. Eastern with Dr. Nancy Tuckman. And we will be discussing, let me go ahead and pull up our full details here, the School of Environmental Sustainability at Loyola University, Chicago. Loyola University, Chicago, yes. And a little bit about Nancy is that Dr. Nancy Tuckman is a professor and founding dean of the School of Environmental Sustainability at Loyola University, Chicago. Leading sustainability initiatives at Loyola for the past 18 years, has the campus consistently ranked in the top 5% of the greenest colleges in the nation, and its climate action plan moves Loyola to carbon neutrality by 2025. So I'm really excited to talk to her about this because that's just, it's incredible, and I'm super happy to see that academia is really getting into just making their universities and their schools green. It's really awesome. So with abstract for this episode is that the School of Environmental Sustainability at Loyola's mission is to engage students in understanding and responding to local and global environmental issues by advancing knowledge of environmental problems and developing solutions through original research and community outreach. Students of SES will be prepared in just multiple aspects of environmental science and environmental policy, and they have 6 undergraduate degrees, 2 master's degrees, 3 graduate certificates. They're going all out, and I'm very excited because it's a brand new school. So trying to contain the emotions. Anyway, so that is what's happening today. Again, we have Doug Parsons on with Dave Jones at 11 a.m. Pacific, 2 p.m. Eastern to talk about the global electricity transition. And then at 3 p.m. Pacific, 6 p.m. Eastern, Dr. Nancy Tuckman will be joining me to talk about the School of Environmental Sustainability at Loyola University, Chicago. And so that is what we have planned for our official Cimpatico episodes today. And now we're going to go ahead and dive into the news. We haven't really done a news discussion in a little bit, and there's been some things going on, so let me go ahead and make sure that this is getting pulled up. One moment. Making sure that we have OBS decided to eat my window capture. So we're just adjusting this really quick. Gotta love back-end technology things. Always fun. But as I've said many times, anything can happen with the live stream. And I think that's what makes them pretty awesome, in my personal opinion. Is you just never know. Will things break? Will there be aliens taking over? Who knows? But it will be live. Alright. Let's go, and this should be just fine. Here we go. And I believe music should be going on in the background. Again, as always, if there's any audio imbalances between like myself, music in the background, please let me know. These are things I can fiddle with live. Okay. So in the news today, we are going through Reuters' environment category, and this morning we have Biden officials making recommendations for protecting 30% of U.S. land and water. Now, there has been conversation, I'm sure many of you who actively follow climate and environmental related news, that around I believe in the EU, there's been conversation in certain countries about preserving 30% of X resource by the year 2030. And then by the year 2050, it's by protecting and preserving 50% by 2050. And so that has been a recent movement, and personally, I think it's pretty cool. But as our viewers know, I am a concerned conservationist, climate activist, and so anything that we can to go and protect our climate, like our environment and our diverse ecosystems, I am very happy about. So into this news, so that is my personal bias there as I go and read this. So, Biden administration officials on Thursday took their first step toward carrying out the president's campaign pledge to conserve 30% of U.S. land and water over the next decade, outlining 6 categories for how land and water should be used. And that is all we have right now. But as that develops, we will go ahead and make sure to stay right on top of that. And then, oh wait, no, that was the preview. Here we are. Let's go. So the report by Interior Secretary Dab Halan, Agriculture Secretary Tom Vislak, Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo, and White House Council on Environmental Quality Chair Brenda Mallory calls on the administration to back locally led conservation projects across the country with investments and focused policies. The president's challenge is a call to action to support locally led conservation and restoration efforts of all kinds and all over America, wherever communities wish to safeguard the lands and waters they know and love, the officials wrote in a report to Biden's National Climate Task Force. In one of his first executive orders, President Joe Biden set a goal to protect 30% of land and water to safeguard sensitive lands and wildlife from extraction and development by 2030 as directed cabinet members to draft recommendations for carrying this out after his first 100 days in office. The report does not offer specifics about which areas could be set aside for conservation or whether they would be protected from productive use or resource extraction. So this is the loophole point, right? So this is, it's one thing to be protected, but we need to know in what way these spaces are being protected, because it's not, it could be like, yeah, it's protected from X thing, but we'll allow these other things. And so we will want to follow that carefully. It's not enough just to say, yeah, it's protected. We need to know what it's protected from, how it's going to be protected, and what is going to be done to like maintain those protections. So it outlines 6 priority areas of focus for the government for land that could ultimately get federal protection or investment. This includes creating more parks and green space in nature-deprived communities, outdoor recreation access, preserving fish and wildlife habitats and corridors, incentivizing voluntary conservation efforts of fishers, ranchers, farmers, and forest owners, supporting tribally led conservation efforts, and investing in resilience and restoration projects, including a civilian climate corps. The report also calls for a new interagency working group to develop a conservation atlas, which would establish a baseline of information on lands and waters that have already been conserved or restored to be able to track progress toward the 2030 goal. Republican lawmakers oppose the so-called 30 by 30 goal. At an event this week, Republicans on the House Natural Resources Committee said they were concerned that the government could designate strict protections on some land that remained productive. Now, on the word productive, my question is, do they mean productive for fossil fuels? Or, honestly, that's probably what it is. As we go ahead and try to decarbonize, the big issue will be like, well, this land has oil wells, so it's productive. It's like, but it's really not. And we really need to be working on phasing this out. And, I mean, you can make the land productive by plugging up the wells and, you know, doing something else with the land. It doesn't have to be just oil drilling. But again, that is my personal bias and my stance on that. Let's go back into the environment category. Also, I'm really not sure how I feel about Reuters like change in their website. It's really bubbly and it feels kind of like an app rather than a web page. But that's just my personal thing. Like I kind of preferred it being in a list. Okay. So, now on to the UK. So, world must go beyond hot air at COP26, climate cement UK's Johnson. Alright, Boris, let's see what he has for us. So, world leaders need to come up with much more than hot air at the United Nations Climate Change Conference in November if the planet is to have any chance of cooling down, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson said on Thursday. Oh. COP26, which will be held in Glasgow, Scotland, is important as it could accelerate measures by the world's biggest polluters to tackle the climate change. I think maybe, did the editor miss that? Okay, so COP26, which will be held in Glasgow, Scotland, is important as it could accelerate measures by the world's biggest polluters to tackle the climate change, which activists, I would have used climate crisis, but I mean, okay, to tackle the climate crisis, which activists, scientists, and world leaders say could ultimately endanger the planet. And ourselves. So as I dive more into like eco communication, science communication, it's a lot of people I've noticed now are really pushing against the well, we need to save the planet, because at the end of the day, the planet is like the planet. We need to be more specific in what we mean by this, in like people and our ecosystems, our biodiversity, our current plants, and like it's not as the planet itself is a floating rock in space, but that has been some comments earlier. So this paragraph itself, I'm just a little bit, I'm nitpicking it, but that's just, I've been doing some more communication studies, and anyway. If all that emergence from COP26 is more hot air, then we have absolutely no chance of keeping our planet cool, Johnson told the virtual Petersburg Climate Dialogue Summit. It must be a summit of agreement, of action, of deeds, not words. For that to happen, over the next 6 months, we must be relentless in our ambition and determination, laying the foundations on which success will be built, he said. Johnson, who is keen to burnish his environmental credentials, said he would push leaders at a group of 7 summit he will chair in June to make firm climate commitments. I'll be seeking commitments from the G7 members to use their voices and their votes, wherever and whenever possible, to support the transition to net zero carbon emissions, kickstart a green industrial revolution, and build economies that withstand whatever our changing climate throws at us, he said. And I also hope to secure a substantial pile of cash with which to help all countries to do that. We simply must meet our existing commitments on climate finance, that long overdue $100 billion a year target, and then we must go further still. Britain wants COP26 summit to be an in-person meeting. It had originally been due to be held in 2020, but had to be postponed due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Johnson said it was up to wealthy countries to take up some of the burden of battling climate change without lecturing poorer countries on clean growth. If we want others to leapfrog the dirty technology, which did so much for us, then we have a moral and practical obligation to help them do so. And that means putting our money where our mouth is. So this is fascinating to me because I have not known Boris to be a climate activist. I mean, for the longest time, wasn't he... Let me know in chat. Like, let me know. Am I like just forgetting something? Because I could have sworn for the longest time, like Trump, Boris, and Bolsonaro were kind of like the 3 climate change denying group. Or I may be wrong at this. Like, this is, I'm really curious to see where this goes. I'm actually gonna go and drop this in my news catalog here, because to do further, this is interesting to me. Fascinating. Okay. And then on that, we have the global carbon pricing system discussion here in sustainable business. So COP26 is happening in November, if I remember correctly. And so as we lead up to it, we're going to be seeing more conversation around sustainable business, green energy transition, just transition, and we are kind of at the point where this has to be the year where things get done. And fingers are crossed. This is just an opinion piece. It'd be very desirable to have a global carbon pricing system. Okay. So let's move back into the environment category here. Germany sets tougher CO2 emissions reduction. All right. So Germany sets tougher carbon emission reduction targets after top court ruling. Germany's conservative-led government announced more ambitious plans to cut greenhouse gas emissions on Wednesday, prodded by a constitutional court ruling and with an eye to the opposition Greens' lead in polls ahead of elections in September, of course. The court said last week the government had failed to set out how it would bring carbon emissions down beyond 2030 after a group of plaintiffs, including North Sea Islanders feeling inundation from climate change, challenged the 2019 climate law as unfit for purpose. Read more. Okay, so that will be a follow-up article there. Finance Minister Olaf Scholz said Germany would now aim for a 65% cut in carbon emissions by 2030 and 88% by 2040. Under the new targets, Germany will also aim for nearly net zero emissions by 2045 rather than 2050 as initially planned, he said. Sorry, there's a dump truck outside reversing, so if y'all hear the beeping, they're literally right outside my window, so I can't do much about that. The existing climate law agreed between Chancellor Angela Merkel's Conservatives and their Social Democrat coalition partners in 2019, after much wrangling, includes a commitment to reduce CO2 emissions by at least 55% by 2030 from 1990 levels and net zero CO2 by 2050. We really need to do a series on just this net zero by 2050 conversation, because the more I read it, the more frustrated I get. We should be net zero by 2030 and net negative by 2050. Like, I need to have a conversation with Rick Parnell. I need to reach out to him and get him here on Cimpatico Daily. Because this is, every time I see net zero by 2050, like, it's just like adding another, like pulling a Jenga piece out of the Jenga tower and just waiting for it to tip over. Like, it's just like feeling the frustration. So Germany's CO2 emissions are already 40% below the 1990 level, Environment Minister Svenja Schulz said on Wednesday. The new targets will mean a further reduction by 25 percentage points in 2020, 23 points in 2030s, and 12 by 2040s. That is a fair offer for the younger generations that we are not leaving the biggest burden for their future, she said. Each decade, each generation takes responsibility. The required change in legislation will go to the cabinet for formal approval next week, Schulz and Schulz said. The Constitutional Court ruled that Germany must update its climate law by the end of next year to set out how it will bring net carbon emissions down to almost zero by 2050 to avoid saddling the young with a disproportionate impact from climate change. Politicians, including those who passed the 2019 law, rushed to welcome the top court ruling at a time when the environmentalist Greens are increasingly as the party to beat in the September national election. With the Greens topping most opinion polls, the ruling parties had sought to quickly agree on changes to carbon emission targets through consensus that appeared difficult to reach until Wednesday's announcement by Schulz. Options to reduce emissions include expanding renewable energy and raising the price of CO2 more quickly than planned. Okay. Of course, it would be politically driven, but at this point, I mean, we need the political will, so even if it's like, we just need to beat the other party if we're getting green policies out of that, like, I should probably talk to Rob about how he feels about that. UN methane report ups pressure on EU to tackle the planet warming gas. So the world must urgently cut its emissions of methane to rein in climate change, a UN report said Thursday, raising pressure on European Union policymakers who are drafting the bloc's first methane regulations targeting fossil fuels. Because methane is a particularly potent greenhouse gas, tackling emissions offers the speediest option for curbing climate change, according to the United Nations Global Methane Assessment, the details of which were reported by Reuters last week. The world could cut methane emissions driven by human activity by up to 45% by 2030 using currently available technologies, the report said. That would avoid nearly 0.3 degrees Celsius of global warming by the 2040s. Failing to tackle methane, however, would push global climate goals out of reach, it added. It's true. If we want to reduce the rate of warming in the near term, methane is the way to do it, said Johan Johan Kulenstierna, research leader at Stockholm Environment Institute and one of more than 20 experts who authored the report. Globally, methane emissions from human activities are rising faster now than at any time since records began in the 1980s, the report said. That is in sharp contrast to the 40 to 45% cut in methane emissions that scientists say is needed by 2030 to limit global warming to safe levels, alongside steep cuts in carbon dioxide emissions. Methane is the second largest contributor to global warming after CO2. The gas has a higher heat-trapping potential than CO2, but breaks down in the atmosphere faster. That means curbing methane emissions in the near future could have a big impact on slowing global warming. While national climate change policies generally target CO2 emissions, scrutiny of methane is growing as governments ramp up efforts to meet climate goals. EU policymakers hope to set an example this year by proposing regulations to limit methane emissions. The first time it has done this in the energy sector, those regulations will likely include forcing oil and gas companies to find and fix methane leaks in their infrastructure. Agriculture is the largest source of Europe's methane emissions, followed by waste sources like landfills, and then fossil fuels, according to the report by the UN Environment Programme and the Climate and Clean Air Coalition. The EU is also the world's biggest importer of natural gas. If Brussels applied its regulations to foreign suppliers, including Russia, this could have economic ripple effects throughout the international supply chains. Last year, the European Commission said it would consider setting methane targets or standards on imported fossil fuels if other countries did not act. Okay. Global meat consumption. All right, so for those in the United States, I'm sure many of you had seen on Twitter, when Biden was talking about climate, and then Twitter took hold of it, and we saw threads upon threads about how Biden is telling people to, go vegan. That is not the case. Emily Atkin did a pretty good piece on this. Actually, I think I have access to her heated newsletter, but let me pull up here really quickly. Also, we're live on Twitter. Am I gonna go and bloop myself here? So create a inception of layers. Here we go. So Cimpatico TV on Twitter, check us out. So Emily Atkin, she did I love her journalism style, and I look up to her so much. So prepare for the meat war. Yes. Okay. I think she made this public to everyone. All right. So I'll finish this, and then we'll dive into her newsletter for this. But so meanwhile, advances in satellite technology have allowed scientists to pinpoint methane sources, which can allow policymakers to target those emissions directly, said Duke University climate scientist Drew Shindell, the lead author of the report. Policy action like that planned by the EU needs to spread around the world so that more and more places have specific targets for methane. The United States is also drafting methane legislation expected to be proposed in September. The U.S. Senate last week voted to restore Obama-era methane rules around oil production and processing. Globally, agriculture accounts for 40% of methane emissions from human activities, while fossil fuels contribute 35%, and waste sources, such as landfills, account for 20%. The biggest opportunities for cutting emissions this decade are in fossil fuel industry, it added, with actions such as plugging infrastructure leaks by being relatively easy and low cost. By contrast, tackling emissions from agriculture, for example, by reducing global meat consumption, is considered harder because it requires changes to people's behaviors and lifestyles. Methane and CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere both surged last year, even as global economic activity sputtered amid the COVID-19 pandemic, the U.S. National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration said last month. To climate scientists, those trends are worrying. We can't kid ourselves that we can solve the climate problem with just methane alone, said NOAA physical scientist Lori Burweiler, based in Boulder, Colorado. We have to confront CO2. Okay. So, This was published by Emily on April 27th, and this was just in light of the Twitter trends after Biden's climate summit, and of course having a certain side of Twitter doing their certain side of Twitter things. So Emily, and for those who do not know Emily Atkin, so she went off on her own and started her Heated World newsletter, and she used to do journalism for a bunch of different other publications, and she decided to go off and do her own thing, and she's been killing it. So, prepare for meat war. The climate battle over meat is going to be worse than energy, an industry researcher says. Oh boy. And I will say, Emily, because she is on her own, she is able to have her, like, personal opinion. So, like, just with this first sentence. So, she's not wrong, but just letting y'all know. So, conservatives are lying about climate change again. The subject this time is red meat, and the lie is that President Joe Biden is planning to limit individual consumption of it by 90% over the next decade. And then, we of course have Fox News running with it, but this was the Twitter thread. Yeah. So this claim is a total fantasy, but for Republicans who want to stymie support for climate action, spreading it is probably an effective strategy. As a food historian, Bruce Craig once told me, there exists a deep American ideology in which abundant food, especially meat, suggests the promise of America, the American cornucopia, and defines who we are as Americans. A perceived threat to the mass availability of cow flesh has a good chance of causing a frenzy. This approach has been successful before. In early 2019, Republicans seized on a comment Rep. AOC made about maybe not eating a hamburger for breakfast, lunch, and dinner to claim that her Green New Deal would outlaw hamburgers. The fact that it wouldn't outlaw hamburgers didn't matter. Standing behind a podium, Rep. Rob Bishop of Utah held up a patty between two buns, took a bite, and said he would never allow the climate activists to take burgers away. This fantasy sparked a backlash so intense that Ocasio-Cortez eventually removed language about factory farming emissions from her office's fact sheet about the Green New Deal. The original draft said the legislation would address the problem of farting cows, referring to methane emissions from cow flatulence. That was eventually changed to emissions from cows, and later it was removed from the sheet altogether. It was a victory for Big Meat, which has been working hard for decades to get climate advocates like Ocasio-Cortez to stop talking about animal agriculture. We should expect that effort to heat up as the Biden administration pushes forward on its climate plan, according to one researcher who studies the meat industry's role in climate policy delay. So how the meat industry works against climate action. The meat industry has spent millions of dollars lobbying against climate policies and funding dubious research that tries to blur the links between animal agriculture and our climate emergency, according to research published in the journal Climatic Change last month. These tactics have deeply mimicked those of the fossil fuel industry, said Jennifer Jacquet, an associate professor of environmental studies at New York University and one of the study's authors. I've often compared beef to the coal of the meat world, she told me. We're seeing the beef industry deploy the same strategies deployed by the coal industry because the writing on the wall is clear. It's going to be very hard to maintain both of those industries in their current state if we're going to tackle the climate crisis effectively. U.S. beef and dairy companies have mimicked fossil fuel companies on climate change in a few key ways, Jacquet says. And one is by funding research that casts doubt on the science connecting the livestock sector to climate change. The science they're primarily trying to cast doubt on shows that 14.5% of all greenhouse gas emissions are associated with livestock supply chains, she said. According to Climate Nexus, this is broadly equivalent to the emissions from all the fuel burned by all the world's transport vehicles, including cars, trucks, trains, boats, and airplanes. So animal agriculture specifically accounts for 5% of global anthropogenic carbon dioxide emissions, represents 44% of anthropogenic methane emissions, the primary driver of climate change related to livestock, as methane is 34 times more potent than carbon dioxide over 100 years, comprises 44% of all anthropogenic nitrous oxide emissions, the most potent greenhouse gas, and makes up 75 to 80% of total agricultural emissions. Due to this, beef and dairy interests have been funding scientists like Frank Mitloehner, who studies... Frank Mitloehner, hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly, who studies air quality at the University of California, Davis, and asserts that livestock and dairy aren't big climate problems. The quintessential Mitloehner take: worry less about the burgers and more about big oil. Journalist Jenny Splitter wrote recently in an in-depth profile of Mitloehner for Undark, which is very much worth reading. Mitloehner also partially credits himself for getting the references to emissions from cows removed from Ocasio-Cortez Green New Deal fact sheet. Of course, he brag about that. Industry favorite experts like Mitloehner's generally point out that in America, farming is only responsible for about 10% of greenhouse gas emissions, and only about half of that comes from animal agriculture. That's true, but this is a climate crisis. We don't really have the option of ignoring one of the main contributors, even if the contributor is not as bad as fossil fuels. Global meat consumption is also projected to grow rapidly, and it's very likely that without regulation, emissions are going to grow with it. Right now, 1/3 of all U.S. animal agriculture emissions come from either livestock methane, farts and burps, or livestock manure management. And got a tweet here. So these things could be regulated, but the meat industry is not a fan of climate regulation. Over the last 2 decades, meat and dairy groups of the U.S. have spent millions on political campaigns, typically to support Republican candidates, according to Vox's report on Decade Study. They've also been lobbying annually against climate policies like cap and trade, the Clean Air Act, and regulations that would require farms to report emissions. So the coming meat wars. The meat industry is thus not likely to take the Biden administration's latest climate push lying down. This tension is going to really heat up, Jaquette said, and it's going to be worth digging into this network of counter movements to addressing meat and dairy's role in climate change, because it will do much of what the fossil fuel companies did. It's also going to be worth countering Republicans' lies on the topic with uncomfortable honesty. No, neither Biden's climate plan nor the Green New Deal seeks to limit individual meat consumption. But as he wrote in 2019, after the AOC incident, the price, availability, and/or source of meat products is probably going to change somewhat. Any comprehensive climate plan must take cows into account, with one obvious solution being to reduce their population. That doesn't mean taking away people's hamburgers, but it does mean making it a rarer and thus more expensive product. This is hardly the greatest sacrifice that will be required to prevent a civilizational catastrophe. But if the world's population simply reduced its meat and dairy consumption, scientists say the effects would be massive. So this is, I've said so many times before, like, the best thing you can do is be vegan or vegetarian, right? That's like the best thing you can do. The second best thing you can do in the personal impact is to just reduce your meat intake. It's not saying to stop completely, but just reduce it. Have a burger like twice a month, or like it. And also just talking about like the health impacts of like consuming a bunch of red meat. It's really not that good for you. So I can't speak for all climate activists, because there are certain branches that are like everyone should be this and everyone should be that. My personal take is just the single best thing you can do is reduce your animal product intake. And if you cannot be vegan or vegetarian for various reasons, just reduce like your animal product intake. Like, it's not going to kill you to not have meat for a meal. Like, you can do like meatless Mondays, and if everyone did meatless Mondays, that would still have a huge effect. I actually do recommend the book How We Got to Climate Change and Where to Go From Here by Hope Jareen, because she talks about the availability of resources and all that. It's a really good book. It's on my idea list to do a video about it. But again, I need to get over the procrastination bump of, it's not necessarily, no, it is procrastination at this point, but it's like the anxious procrastination that all starting whenever a content creator is starting on a new platform of like, oh no, like it's not going to be good right away. And it's like, well, of course it's not going to be good right away. Like you're learning, like it takes 100 bad videos before you have like a good video, but it's like, but that's still 100 times I'm looking at bad things. So I'm working on it. There will be good content coming out soon. Probably bad video quality, but hopefully good content. Ignore the video, listen to what's being said, basically. Jaquette thinks that the battle over meat regulation will be uglier than fossil fuels because it surrounds a choice that individual Americans make directly. I think the meat wars are going to be worse than energy, she said. This is the question that people ask themselves 3 times a day. It can't play out behind the scenes. At the same time, she doesn't expect more of the flat-out lies to come directly from meat companies or trade groups. Rather, she expects them from politicians, pundits, and networks with whom the industry is ideologically aligned in pursuit of maintaining the status quo. Unfortunately, the status quo happens to be a climate emergency, so the lies are not likely to be inconsequential. The question is no longer who will tell them, but who will allow them to spread unchecked. And this has been a huge kind of contention point, especially in media and like science communication. And I mean, we can even take a look. This has been huge on Twitter too. It's like when we see news articles about, I mean, I'll just call it as what it is. Y'all know that I'm a leftist, so you know my biases. Take everything, you know, with a grain of salt, of course. But as we see news articles about police brutality, and then the headlines will be kind of fluffed in a way to try to make it not sound as bad, but it is really bad. And we're seeing that with climate science and climate communications as well in certain mainstream media publications, and that needs to stop. I think, and again, this is all my personal opinion, we need to be a bit more blunt about what's going on rather than like, oh, well, yeah, you know, maybe this. It's like, no, like, hey, things. If we stop trying to worry about clicks and instead just told the truth. Anyway, that's my take though. Epicurus joins the meat wars. Big news on the meat and climate front from the recipe publisher yesterday. So, and then this organization got a lot of heat on Twitter for this, but they announced that Epicurus is cutting out beef. It won't appear in new Epi recipes, articles, newsletters, or on social. This isn't a vendetta against cows or people who eat them. It's a shift about sustainability, not anti-beef, but pro-planet. For more on how the meat industry will likely respond, I recommend this thread from NYU's Matthew Hayek. Click the tweet to see the whole thing. So, and what was funny about this is they had removed meat from their recipes a year ago. They just never announced it. Or they removed red meat from the recipes a year ago. They just never announced it. And then they announced it, and then there was a bunch of backlash. So it's like, it wasn't a problem until they said they did the thing, which I found very interesting. My throat's getting a little bit dry. I'm talking so much. Alright. One of the most common practices of backlash I've seen so far is that meat isn't as big a climate problem as fossil fuels, and we should focus on that instead. Again, this is a meat industry talking point and goes against everything we know about solving climate change, which is that we have to tackle everything, not just one thing. I personally think the Epicurus move is huge. Let me know what you think in the comments. So that is Emily Atkin. If y'all don't know who she is, please follow her. And like subscribe to her newsletter if you can afford to subscribe to her newsletter. I love the way she talks about things, and she's just kind of very no BS about things. So she's great. Definitely recommend her. Okay, so we have about 30-ish, like 30 to 40 minutes until gotta wrap up here to prepare for Doug's episode. So we're actually going to segue a little bit because I do have a story about oh wait, I'm currently streaming. Oh wait, really? So I thought I was on mine. Did it not save? Alright, one moment. Sorry, I'm getting a message from my tech team here, just double checking what's going on. Okay, never mind. Okay, false alarm. Like I said, today is a testing streaming settings day, so there might be occasional tech interruptions like now as we figure things out. So it looks like things are okay here. All right, get this back onto this monitor, and we are going to be migrating. So we're changing directions, going to be moving into a conversation around plastic, because I have a personal story about this from when I went fishing yesterday, but we're going to go ahead and play Charlie's plastic pollution video first. So let me go ahead and mute these things here. Make sure this is pulled up. Okay. And for those who do not know who Our Changing Climate is, Charlie is wonderful and he makes very informational and beautiful climate and environment related videos. I do recommend his YouTube channel, Our Changing Climate. He's a very cool person.
Into the sea. Along the banks of the Mississippi River, right before it spills out past New Orleans into the sea, lies Cancer Alley, an 85-mile strip of Mississippi shoreline where residents are contracting cancer at astronomical rates. But this isn't a phenomenon based in genetics or some cruel twist of fate. Cancer Alley is the product of environmental pollution. And today, we're going to figure out exactly where this pollution is coming from. This is the story of plastics, the harm they cause, the industries that create them, and how that 85-mile strip of Mississippi shoreline and other areas like it are suffering because of them. This video is sponsored by CuriosityStream, which now comes with Nebula for free when you sign up using the link in the description. If you walk into your kitchen, pretty much everything in some way or another has encountered plastic. The plastic bags you stuff into a drawer, your favorite cup, and even the package keeping those blueberries fresh. But despite plastic's ubiquity, we often forget where it comes from. Indeed, when it comes to plastic, our efforts seem to be much more focused on what happens after we use it than before we use it. So first, let's understand how plastic gets made. It all starts here, or here. That's right, plastics are basically just fossil fuels in solid form. In fact, 99% of plastics are made from chemicals rooted in fossil fuels. The plastic creation process begins with crude oil, coal, or natural gas, which is then refined and distilled or cracked into usable chemical compounds such as ethylene or benzene. Of course, there are certain plastics that are the product of recycled goods, but I'll get into recycling later. The key thing here is that the plastic we use so heavily is really the same as the petroleum we put in our cars or the natural gas we use to heat our homes, which is one of the reasons why the fossil fuel industry loves plastics. With the compounding economic, pandemic, and environmental crises bearing down on the fossil fuel industry, Big Oil seems to be in trouble. BP reported losses of $5.7 billion in 2020, while ExxonMobil lost a staggering $22.4 billion. It was truly a crushing year for the fossil fuel industry, and yet oil and gas executives still seem optimistic. Exxon says it hopes to grow by 4% each year, and part of their scheme to achieve that growth involves
plastics.
Indeed, plastic seems to be the fossil fuel industry's escape plan from the transition to a zero-carbon world. We are now witnessing Big Oil pour resources into many new plastic factories. North of Corpus Christi, Texas, ExxonMobil secured hundreds of millions of dollars in tax breaks to build a natural gas distillation or cracking site to produce plastics. Shell has also put its faith in plastics, investing in a multi-billion-dollar ethane cracking factory on the Ohio River in Pennsylvania, which when finished will churn out 1.6 billion metric tons of plastic pellets every year. Chevron's building a new plant, and so is Total. All told, the fossil fuel industry has announced 349 chemical and plastic projects since 2010. Greenpeace Executive Director Annie Leonard explains this obsession with plastic in a PBS Frontline report.
Single-use plastic is their plan B. They're not going to be able to continue to drill that oil and gas and burn it for energy anymore. So this is their lifeline. They're going to double down on single-use plastic like we have never seen.
And all of this new plastic infrastructure means increased production and ultimately a barrage of emissions. Because alongside the physical pollution of plastics littered in our waterways and immediate environments, plastic is causing a colossal greenhouse gas problem. Back in Cancer Alley, despite community organizing and some small victories, things are looking worse. Yet another plastic factory is trying to make its way through the permitting process, which, considering the region and country's history of complete disregard for the health and well-being of the low-income communities of color that live in the area, the construction of this heavily polluting factory comes as no surprise. Cancer Alley is the product of the environmental racism that pervades the US and the world.
I have 100 people in the meeting. Has anybody in the room had anybody in their house die of cancer? Everybody stand up.
When the factories surrounding these communities break up natural gas and crude oil into usable compounds for plastic, rubber, or fertilizer, they also release tons and tons of highly toxic carcinogenic compounds into the air. As a result, the EPA told one town in Cancer Alley, St. John's Parish, that they face the highest risk of cancer in the country. But even if they somehow escape the grips of cancer, residents like Marilyn Francois can barely breathe taking out the trash.
By the time I left from the trash can back in the house, I was breathing hard. And I knew it was something that was in that air.
But the creation of plastics is not just a local problem, it's a global one too. A comprehensive report on plastic creation worldwide reveals that if industry continues with a business as usual approach, by 2050, plastics will create 56 billion metric tons of greenhouse gas emissions, which is 10 to 13% of the entire remaining carbon budget. The report goes on to say that the plastic and petrochemical industry's current plans to expand plastic production threaten to exacerbate plastic's climate impacts and could make limiting global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius impossible. All told, Carbon Tracker estimates that for every metric ton of plastic created, $1,000 in externalities like health and environmental destruction are also created. Essentially, even before plastics reach our shelves and get thrown into our seas, its impacts are massive, and fossil fuel companies are to blame. Right about now, you might be thinking, well, I guess that means I should recycle more, right? Here's the thing, that's exactly what the fossil fuel industry wants you to do. In fact, for well over 40 years, the plastic and fossil fuel industries have poured millions of dollars into marketing campaigns, shifting the blame away from industry and onto the consumer.
People start pollution, people can stop it.
And now, I am what I've always wanted to be.
Remember, a lot of the plastic packaging that you have in your kitchen is recyclable.
The reality is that only 9% of plastic actually gets recycled. That's because the majority of the plastic we use, while theoretically recyclable in the lab, is just too costly to recycle in practice. That's right, the majority of plastics we're throwing in our recycling bins end up in the landfill. And if you think this isn't the fault of the plastics industry, you might be surprised to find that those little triangles on the back of your container are not a sign of their recyclability. They are instead a system that helps you identify what kind of plastic the container is made out of. In fact, the plastics industry used this triangle logo to trick customers into thinking their plastic was recyclable.
That code was a numbering system put inside the well-known symbol for recycling. The problem, recyclers said, is that it left the impression that all those kinds of plastics were actually being recycled.
As a result, recycling plants are inundated with non-recyclable plastics, while consumers continue to buy and recycle thinking they've avoided plastic's impact. In short, by placing the emphasis on recycling, which happens after the plastic has been made and the profits pocketed, the fossil fuel and plastic industries could get people to buy more by assuaging consumer guilt about pollution. Or, as the head of the Society of the Plastics Industry puts it,
if the public thinks the recycling is working, then they're not going to be as concerned about the environment.
There is some hope though. Carbon Tracker predicts that the demand for plastic won't match up to what fossil fuel companies predict, and reveals that the plastics industry is ripe for regulation that can squeeze fossil fuel industries even more. But the key thing here is that that won't happen unless we mobilize. And no, I'm not talking about straw bans. I made a whole video about why they're ineffective and ableist. What needs to happen is a re-envisioning of how our packaging and production systems work. As individuals, especially in countries like the United States, especially for the elite who generate disproportionate amounts of waste and emissions, it is important to think hard about our relationship to consumption. But of course, reducing consumption, plastic or otherwise, is a difficult prospect in a world that has plastic wrapped everything. Nowadays, you can't even buy lettuce without buying plastic, which means that the path towards decentering plastic has to focus on changes along systemic lines. Corporations need to cease these destructive practices, and people and governments have the power to force them to do that. On the policy level, this means not subsidizing new plastic plants and requiring companies to pay for or internalize the environmental and social costs of plastics, including the costs that have already been incurred by people in areas like Cancer Valley. But until the fossil fuel industry is forced to reckon with the immense harm it's caused, it will continue to hold on to plastic for dear life. Now, you may still be thinking, well, if not plastic, then what else? What sort of plastic alternatives are available right now? So I've uploaded an extended version of this video that dives a bit into plastic alternatives on the streaming platform my creator friends and I built called Nebula. The bonus content replaces this ad because there.
All right, so we have talked kind of extensively. I feel like on Cimpatico I've talked a bit kind of extensively. I mean, I played the whole PBS Frontline video for a Cimpatico daily on plastic pollution a while ago. The conversation around plastic, and I have this kind of a personal story since now I'm learning how to fish now that I'm in the Pacific Northwest, and like participating in that, and that has been interesting because I've never fished before and I've never done that before, and I've always had a weird relationship with hunting and everything, but I digress. I'm like talking to more people out here and with Fish and Wildlife about all of this. It's been kind of an interesting branch in conservationism and protecting the environment, especially in addressing like invasive species issues and that kind of thing. So this is an area that I'm exploring and learning more about, and seeing what kind of allies are in this space. But I digress though. So there's this lake that we go to. I think the first, so I'll roll it back. So realizing how much plastic is in our daily lives from our specific activities. So taking fishing, for example, your fishing line. And that is a lot of plastic, and that can be a lot of waste. And then you're also looking at the packaging for fishing hooks. And then you also have the packaging for your bait, which is most likely in plastic, or sometimes you can get power bait that's in glass jars. Plastic for your snacks. Like, so yesterday when we went fishing, I took a real look at what was going on around the banks of the lake. Like I think bank of the lake is, I think that's a proper term. Or the beach of the lake, basically. And realizing how much waste was there, and that there's no trash can at this lake that is serviced by Fish and Wildlife. So I'm getting on a rampage to be like, hey, like we need like a dumpster or something so people can put their trash here instead of just like letting it float in the lake. Because this like, it's bad for the ecosystem. It's just bad for people, and it looks terrible. Like this is absolutely atrocious. But anyway, I digress. And realizing how much waste just in plastic is around in this area. So when my boyfriend was fishing, I was going around just picking up like a lot of trash, and a lot of it was just loose fishing line that has been wrapped around in bushes or is now rooted around like the algae and like kelp that's growing in the lake. And it's when you take a moment to really look at your surroundings or like the products that you're buying, or just kind of like your daily systems, and seeing what is involved, like what single-use items are involved in that, and you realize that they're literally everywhere. As Charlie mentioned in his video, it's so hard to be zero waste, and we've seen trends on YouTube and social media about being zero waste, but it could be argued that that is it's a luxury to be able to afford that, especially if you're in lower income areas, or like food deserts, for example, and all you can get are things wrapped in plastic so they can be preserved longer. So we've made it I'm trying to think of the term it is now a luxury to not participate in the single-use market. I think that makes sense. Let me know in chat if I'm not making sense. I'm kind of trying to phrase this as I go. But we've essentially have made it a luxury life experience to be able to go to a market where you can buy things in bulk. And if you're buying things in bulk, typically sometimes it can be like, oh, like it's a luxury store, like a Whole Foods or a Sprouts or whatever your luxury grocer is, where you can buy things in bulk with your reusable containers. Some areas don't even have that, or even if you're going to your local farmers market, or some areas might not even have local farmers markets because, again, it's like more of a food desert. And when we take just that moment to see where plastic or single-use items are involved in our life, it can also get really overwhelming. For example, I mean, even if a similar thing, if you were to look at your daily life and consumption of energy, and unless you know exactly where, like if you're already paying for a green grid, like solar panel grid, and getting energy credits or anything like that, most likely your grid is not green. And so every time, if you were to go, and there was a professor I follow on Twitter who's talking about at the start of their semester for their sustainable grid like course, like urban development, that's like sustainable course. She has the class for a day make a note every single time they're using energy, and to see how integrated it is in our lives. So that's like every time you're using your phone, because you have to charge your smartphone, every time you're turning on your lights, every time you have hot water for your shower, opening the fridge, she always notes that a lot of these reports stop about after the first 2 hours of them recording it, because they'll do a timesheet for it. It's because it's so overwhelming when you actually sit down and like really look at where how much energy is being used, and how much we just kind of overlook because it's so ingrained in our daily routine. And that's the same for single-use plastics. So my action and takeaway there is, if you are able to, because again, it is a luxury at this point to be sustainable, even in specific categories and specific degrees, but if you're able to, see where your waste is. Like, is it in single-use like how much single-use plastic is in your life, and could some of that be replaced for things that are reusable, such as glass? Instead of plastic bags for shopping, you can have reusable bags, or you can pull a thing that Germany does, and they have, instead of even just bagging things, just have your collapsible bin that just sits in the back of your car and also can go in your grocery cart. I'm actually looking at those because those are just like easier to remember than, our reusable bags that just hang in a closet, because it lays flat and just sits in the trunk of your car. So there's a lot of ways that we can adjust our daily lives in small areas to be a bit more sustainable, and it doesn't need to be something incredibly drastic. Now, circling this back around on the topic of when we were reading Emily's point about red meat consumption, there are ways to not destroy the daily routine. It's like, no, just, hey, instead of a burger today, I'm gonna go and have a sandwich or something that's like it could be like a chicken sandwich. It doesn't have to be like a red meat burger, be a chicken sandwich. There's ways to just change little things up. And once you get started and really paying attention to what's going on around in your daily consumption, then it's a bit easier to be like, oh yeah, actually, this area of my life is pretty oversaturated with this. Let's go ahead and change it, etc., etc. Anyway, that's my morning soapbox conversation and tying the whole conversations that we have had together. And for a last tidbit here before signing off, because I have a little bit of work I gotta do as we prepare also for Doug to come on for his episode. Again, we are currently streaming this on our YouTube channel, also here on Cimpatico, and also on Twitter at Cimpatico TV. Please check us out on all the socials. Greatly appreciate it. And for those who are just now tuning in, it's a pleasure to meet you. I'm Kayla Anderson, the host of the Climate EDU channel here on Cimpatico, and also of Cimpatico Daily. Climate EDU hosts conversations with academics and students about their research and whole student life academic programs, everything surrounding climate and environment. And then then Cimpatico Daily, what we're doing right now, is more of a laid-back, casual conversation. Because on Thursdays, we're 1 day away from Friday, which is 2 days away from the weekend. And sometimes it's nice to just listen and to a more laid-back, casual conversation, doing the work on Thursdays. And so that is what we do here, having just conversation about the news, my personal hot takes, when guests are interested, hopping into a call and also giving their personal opinions or hot takes. And it's just really more mellow, have your favorite morning drink, or for those time zone wizards in different areas, your favorite afternoon drink or your favorite nightly drink. Just hanging out with us and having a nice conversation about climate and environment related topics. And with that, we're going to wrap up here. We will be back in approximately a little over 45 minutes for Doug's episode, talking about decarbonization on the energy grid. Again, if you're interested in learning more about that, and also the role of coal in Asia and how that is how we're trying to remove or decarbonize that facet of the fossil fuel production burning in the world, I do recommend this. And I know personally I will be there in the chat because my degrees are in East Asian Studies and Environmental Science and Policy, and so for that point of the conversation, I am extremely excited. I love talking about this kind of thing. So thank you once again for tuning in to Cimpatico Daily. After Doug's episode, we will be back with some episode reruns leading up to my personal episode with Dr. Nancy Tuckman at 3. So after Doug's episode, running from about 11 to 11:30, 11:45, depending on just chatting how long the conversation goes for, we will be back at noon for a few episode reruns, and then my live episode with Dr. Tuckman will be at 3. So from 1 to about 2:45, we'll have just some great episode reruns from some of our great guests and organizations that we've that we have talked with here on Cimpatico, and we'll have a live episode at 3 for the School of Sustainability at Loyola University Chicago. So thank you for everyone who's watching either on Cimpatico, Twitter, or YouTube. Once again, I am Kayla Anderson. I am your science communicator and environmental edutainer, and I look forward to seeing you at 3 Pacific, 6 Eastern. See you soon. Oh.